So hello and welcome to the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the Ombudsman for Digital Labour Markets at the trade union Unionen, Victor Bernhardtz. How are you doing, Victor?
Doing fine. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on the program, and basically just begin a little bit by saying a little bit about your background, but also the role of Unionen and your position in the marketplace.
No, sure. I mean, my background is I've been working at Unionen for 4 years in this current role. Unionen, for those who don't know, is the largest trade union in Sweden. We organize private white-collar sector workers. And since we do that, we, of course, have a great interest in anything digitalization and sort of monitoring and evaluating that development in order to see what we as a union need to do to make the labor market as functional as possible and prosperous as possible for our members.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is digitalization changing the world of work?
I mean, in many ways, obviously, if you look at where I sit, looking at private sector white-collar workers in Sweden, they see and they can expect to see more of digitized transitions in the way that they are working. Yeah. And that will affect their labor, their work in ways that they perhaps, I'm going to say perhaps not signed up for, but weren't probably sort of planning on. I mean, if you look at blue-collar work, for example, you have an ever-evolving, constant transitioning in new machinery, new robotics that's been going on ever since sort of production on larger scale was introduced in factories hundreds of years ago. Whereas for white-collar work, you've seen perhaps a development of the tools you use from pen and paper to a typewriter, the fax machine, and so on. I mean, this isn't entirely new. It's, of course, evolution more than a revolution.
Yes.
But still, I would say with digital work tools, you speed up that process and you enlarge the scale or the scope of what you can do. I mean, compare how many fax messages you can send in a given day compared to how many emails you can send in a given day. Of course, there's a massive shift there. And now with the introduction of more or less sophisticated AI and machine learning technology, data-driven production, that changes the ball game in many ways for some people, which will mean the change in work tasks for some people, transition and change in the entire profession, perhaps. So yeah, lots going on.
And perhaps within this as well, there's a change in the role of the trade unions and the role and how they go about the representation function.
I wouldn't say it changes the role of trade unions per se, but I think it changes what we need to do. I mean, this will provide us with a new set of policy issues to look at, as well as concrete issues on things that needs to be managed in the local workplace level by local representatives. Because, for example, the introduction of a digital system that gathers data from all of your employees, how do we as a union perceive that? What does that mean for us? Something that wasn't around before. Interestingly, though, we have in place since decades systems and collectively bargained regulations on process for introduction of these types of things. So while we have a development of new issues, we are not seeing currently that we need to adapt the structures, because the structures are built to inherently encompass change and to make change possible sort of throughout. Because I mean, the Swedish, the Nordic collective bargaining system has inherently one big sort of component. One point of this system is that you're able to adapt relations between workers and employers throughout time, regardless of. I mean, it's sort of, sometimes I try to say that collective bargaining is technology neutral. It doesn't really care sort of the specific technology that sets the parameters for whatever issue you want to negotiate, you can still negotiate, basically. You can shake hands.
Yeah, it's just the different processes that are changed, and how is the sort of the regulatory framework changing to allow this? Is it fitting in with this model, or is it posing a threat, would you say, Victor?
I mean, we've been doing a lot of thought and sort of deep digging into seeing, does sort of the digital evolutions in the 21st century, does that mean that we need to adapt or change things significantly on a structural level? And we have come to the conclusion that luckily no. Again, because old regulation proves itself to be quite fit to regulate new phenomena. Then again, of course, this will not work in every way or in every aspect. And one has to also understand that within that sort of statement lies that collective bargaining agreements are renegotiated on a very regular basis, biannually, every 3 years, every years, depending on sort of period you negotiate with between employers and employees organizations. And that means that the negotiations are always fresh in a sense, because you always negotiate from the current sort of standpoint where you are. And if you look at the legal framework, a lot of the things that are in place are also sort of able to encompass this. We have, I mean, just the other week, the Swedish government set to the next stage of a legislative process a very large set of regulation and processes that will change and improve lifelong learning, for example. Of course, is a key component in this, and this is something that employee unions and employers organizations have been working on for years and years. So we're really happy to finally see this come into this fruition. And then there are some sort of details we can talk about pertaining to occupational safety and health, for example, where some regulations might not be fully adapted. But in the larger scheme, regulation sort of is holding here. That's not a challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, at the Swedish level, we've got sort of the work environment policy, and of course the sort of the changes or the proposals which will be coming out very soon, linked to arbetsmiljö and how this is going to operate. Do you foresee any big changes that are needed here, Victor?
I mean, it depends on how you define big, but I think what's currently being looked at is the responsibility that one has. If you organize a workplace, you have a certain level of responsibility for occupational safety health for the people who work there, regardless of who they are technically employed by. And this is now being looked at to see, does this need to be changed or sort of tweaked in any way? And that government investigation currently sits. So I wouldn't presume to sort of tell them what they should end that, because they would probably have a better understanding of that than I would. So I sort of eagerly expecting the outcomes from that study, that process.
And at the European level, we've got in December, we had a new proposal that came out on platform economy worker rights, coming in with sort of specific criteria for presuming employment, for example, new roles and responsibilities to bring in people within sort of the platform and gig economy, a new framework. What are your thoughts on this, and of course the thoughts of Unionen on the proposal that came out before Christmas?
It is very interesting. I mean, we knew this was coming. It's been a long time coming. This is not something that, I mean, to begin with, that we have sort of seen a great need for from a Swedish perspective. We haven't sort of asked for this, if you will. But nonetheless, now it's here, so it's something we need to sort of look at. And I mean, since in December 9th is sort of in legal and policy analyst term, that's just yesterday, right?
Yes, exactly.
I mean, we're recording this at the beginning of February, just 2 months out, with Christmas and New Year's in between. So this process is moving really fast. So in my analysis here, while of course me and my colleagues have done a lot of work on this, still should be considered to be preliminary, because we're still working on this. We're still looking at where to go. But I mean, I guess the ambition for this proposal, isn't bad. Like, you see everyone can see there are clear challenges in other European Union member states. Beginning to platform work. No discussion like that. That's a given. Otherwise, this wouldn't come. And I mean, of course, I would support the ambition to improve the working conditions for platform workers. I would support any initiative to make this way of organizing work improve that, because it's you have the entire spectrum of some sort of platform companies who are doing, in my view, really well. And on the other spectrum, other platform companies who are clearly using this business model in order to circumvent existing labor regulation and or collective bargaining, which is something we, of course, do not approve of, because that creates unfair competition for companies that exist, and essentially bad for markets and bad for productivity. I mean, the whole wonderful thing about the Swedish labor market, how it's constructed, is that extremely wide collective bargaining coverage. And I would say extreme here because we're super high. We're in the sort of low 90% of workers are covered by a collective bargaining agreement in Sweden. That forces productivity to increase and sort of pushes innovation, because you can't compete on the market with sort of depreciating your wages or pension pay. You can't compete by depreciating your standards for occupational safety and health and so on. You have to compete by having the best product. And that, I think, is really good and really key for a small country far away from sort of economic highways such as Sweden, highly export dependent, extremely interlinked with the global markets. We can't, while we also have a country where we sort of value a stable welfare system and universal education and so on and so forth, we can't compete with wage levels, and we can't compete with sort of, producing things on the margins. We have to compete with essentially very high quality products, sort of both services and goods. And if you want to have a labor market and an economy that's built on that, anything that pushes innovation is good. And the lovely thing here is that you have a system that both pushes that innovation, but also has, over the last 30 years, and I'm not kidding here, given us a 60% real wage increase, which compared to most other countries is fantastic. So within that framework, our lesson is that, of course, it's good for our members, because real wage increase is always something we see as a key component of a functional labor market, but also that the companies where they work are improving their outputs because they are competing on product, not on other things. And that's why I think also for the platform economy business model as a whole in the long run, if platform company actors were to compete with the product, not with depreciating standards, that's probably good for that business model as well in the long run.
Absolutely. And
sort of, sure.
Yeah, no, I was going to say to go on from that. I mean, there's obviously sort of a very clear framework, clear way of doing things. Is there almost a risk that unintended or intended consequences of kind of legislation from Brussels, from outside, that could basically threaten the Swedish or the Nordic model within the approach that's being taken?
This is, of course, a concern, and then that's always a concern. This is why we also were opposed to, a legal minimum wage on the EU level, for example.
Yeah.
Because similar here. I mean, we are happy that this proposal does not have any regulations on a sort of so-called third category that sort of would be in between employed and self-employed, like running your own company, which in the Swedish tax code would be sort of more of a sole trader. I think it's a bit, because self-employed has so many weird direct translations between Swedish and English that a sole trader, essentially a person who has a registration for VAT, for example. You send your invoice.
Yes.
And like either you do or you don't. That's basically what you have in the Swedish labor market, and we like to keep it that way.
Right.
And we're happy that this sort of proposal doesn't move in a direction where you will have a third category, which has been a strand in debate on and off during the last decade. But the Commission isn't interested in that. They've said explicitly, and also that is reflected in these proposals. That's good. And of course, one of the sort of guiding principles of this proposal is this presumption you mentioned, that platform people who work through platform companies should be presumed to be employed. Is essentially the essence of this. Of course, there's a set of criteria what that presumption should involve, and there are this proposal sets down the process for how this should be sort of determined, and so on and so forth. And we see that, I mean, we have, preliminary, what we see is that it's a bit ambiguous when and where this process will kick in. It's also ambiguous sort of when are sort of, in quotation marks, only the genuinely employed included in the discussions of the paragraphs that this proposal is made up of, when and where would everyone, including the sole traders, also be included here. There is ambiguity on a couple of things here that makes it make for us unsure, is this the proper sort of legal basis in the charter,
right?
And how would this presumption in practice sort of play out? I mean, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to sort of pretend that I could go very deep into why presumption as a legal concept is problematic or at least difficult or challenging. But it is somewhat challenging. Another thing in the proposal that we think is interesting is that the Commission wants to regulate so-called algorithmic management, which is something that we are sort of looking at in general as well. The way I see it, algorithmic management was, introduced to the labor markets of the world through platform economy and business models, and essentially algorithmic management here being the automation, or at least semi-automation, of intermediation in the platform sense, intermediation of very short work tasks by the use of data. That data could be, for example, person X has these skills and is in this physical location. Company Y needs to have someone do task X for a couple of hours, and then this a data-driven system will match these two people in this business model. That's essentially the point of platform economy business models, to make it sort of to boil it down. Of course, it's way more complex than this in some cases, but this is sort of the essence here, that an automated process makes something happen that would earlier require someone with pen and paper and probably a phone as well. And that can sort of cut transaction costs, cut friction, and make it perhaps profitable to intermediate a very short period, a short work task. Because previously using pen and paper and a phone, probably the labor cost for organizing this work is higher than the labor cost for the actual task, and that's why we haven't seen this previously. So this is sort of a key component of what you can sort of label as algorithmic management. However, as I see it, this is not interesting only for companies with platform economy business models. This is, data-driven work, algorithmic management will be interesting for sort of any company who has, of some size where it sort of would make sense to sort of just not only talk to people in the office or sort of at the work site, wherever that might be. And there are some, I mean, I think some interesting potential here. Also, there are some, pitfalls. We could sort of go into that in another podcast, perhaps. But the interesting point here is that the Commission wants to regulate algorithmic management specifically in platform economy business models. And I mean, we see the way we sort of analyze this is that this is probably a step towards wanting to do the same for the sort of larger segments of the labor market, because how are you going to differentiate? Like, when and where does a company start or stop being a platform company? Like, when and where should this algorithmic management legislation kick in or not kick in?
Right.
And I think trying to regulate a specific way of doing things within a specific but quite loosely defined business model, sort of, it seems challenging to me. Preliminary, I don't think I don't know how that's gonna be able to sort of possibly actually sort of carry out. And then that's some things in this proposal, like sometimes it refers to phrasing such as the appropriate procedures or the relevant legislation, not defining what these proper procedures, this relevant legislation. One of my favorite, competent authorities. It's like, who is that?
I'm sure most authorities would see themselves as competent, or maybe not. But that's the thing. And I think you've got a very good point there. It's about sort of making sure this is applicable to all, and of course, where it's efficiencies, yes. But if we get the other extreme, like firing people through algorithms, I mean, it's a nightmare situation that I think that most people would be completely against.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with this proposal. Politically, a lot of people would put themselves behind the idea to sort of improve the more sort of unwanted outcomes of the platform economy business model. And it's been obvious again in the debate for the last decade. No discussion. There are things that are sort of going on here under the flag of platform economy that we do not want.
Okay.
It's not good for workers. It's not good for sort of economies. It creates challenges for social security systems and so on and so forth. But sort of putting yourself behind that moral statement, if you will, of course, doesn't automatically make this proposal the best solution for that. Right. While again, and these are preliminary comments, there are some things in this proposal that I think are quite interesting. I guess in sort of whenever this sort of moves on, for me, one of the most important issues is that this legislation, in whichever shape and form it finally arrives, is that it gives full respect to national legislation in member states pertaining to labor rights, labor regulation, and related regulation as well. Because otherwise, I think it will be, as you said earlier, it will put a cog in the, I would really say, really efficient machinery of the Swedish labor market model. Again, it provides us with high labor market sort of participation, real wage increase, Sweden scores high in innovation rankings, and so on and so on. Things are really working in this labor market. It's in many respects a very functioning one, I would say. So don't fix what ain't broken. I
think,
but
I think
instead have a sort of
a good approach to be taken, and don't meddle too much with things. And I think this is something that we're just at the beginning, as you say.
Because like having said that, like of course the labor market isn't without its challenges, and the platform economy in Sweden is not sort of fixed and finished in all respect. Of course, I mean, we still have a lot of work to do. I'm just saying that the legal and regulatory framework for that work isn't the problem. Isn't a challenge. Like, we have all the sort of structures in place that we need to sort of look at these challenges. And I always like to make a comparison to temp agency work, which is, I mean, it's not perhaps related to platform economy, but adjacent to platform economy at least. And some platform company business model firms are indeed doing temp agency work using that method. Temp agency work was made legal in Sweden in 1993. It was prohibited before to have a sort of private work intermediation. It was a state monopoly, which of course today feels a bit strange, but you know, that was then. It's a long time ago now, actually. This is 30 years ago. So we can look at history in hindsight. And in the beginning, how temp agency work was going to be organized and regulated was a huge challenge, highly problematic in some ways. How things worked out, there weren't standards and so on. There was some adversity from traditional labor market actors towards this business model existing. And of course, if you're adverse to something and you don't think it should exist, you're less inclined to perhaps sort of look at solving problems. Right. But in the long term, all the sort of labor market actors matured, came together and started to sort of how do we organize and regulate this? Then now we have this, and today it is since quite a long time a sector of the labor market that is regulated, I think properly. So, and you didn't have to change sort of the overarching structures of collective bargaining to do that, but you did find this essentially collective bargaining agreements for temp agencies. Right. That was the solution that was chosen, and I would say it's working. But it takes time. That's really the point. I mean, we live in an age of very short-term gratification. Absolutely. in general, and that goes for sort of politics and policy as well. People you see this problem and you want to have it fixed sort of immediately. And sort of, regulation, adaptation takes time. Getting everyone on board takes time. Writing, collective bargaining agreement or writing new legislation you want to, that also takes time. And these things probably should take time because they're designed to be durable over time. Yes. So if it takes us a couple of years to get all these things in place, that's not a big concern of me, because our experience is that if we allow this to take the time it needs to take, we create sustainable systems that will make it easy for companies to sort of have a good expectancy of this is how things are going to be organized now. Now we have the framework. Okay, great, let's do business. Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be a longer process. We're just starting off on that, but it will be really interesting to sort of keep the discussion going, see how this pans out at the national and the European level, and to continue the dialogue, Victor. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for sort of explaining your viewpoints, where things are going, and some of your insights here as well. Really appreciate it. No, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much. Thank you.